When I first noticed the neighbor walking toward our porch with something small and plastic in his hand, I thought it was a lost item from our backyard. Maybe a toy. Maybe a garden tool. But when he said, "This fell off my camera last night, thought you might want to see what's on it," my stomach dropped in a way I hadn't felt in years. I smiled. I thanked him. I took the flash drive like it meant nothing. But inside, everything trembled. I held that tiny thing in my hand as if it weighed 1,000 pounds, like it had already seen too much. Too much of what I didn't yet dare to admit, not even to myself. I locked the door behind me and sat in the kitchen, staring at the untouched coffee on the table and the glow of the laptop screen waiting for a file to be opened. I knew what it might show. I knew what I had let happen. But I didn't know if I was ready to see it through someone else's eyes. Especially someone who didn't mean to catch us. And definitely not like that. Before I clicked play, I closed my eyes. I told myself that if I saw what I feared, it would only confirm the truth I already lived with in silence. This wasn't about guilt. It was about gravity. And gravity was pulling everything down faster than I could stop it. 3 months ago, I made a choice. One small choice. One quiet moment. And now it was all about to come undone. But before I tell you what was on that screen, and what came after, tell me, where are you watching this from? And have you ever made a mistake so quiet, it screamed every time you closed your eyes? When he told me his brother would be staying with us for a while to help with the kitchen renovation, I smiled and said it was a good idea. In truth, I didn't care. Or maybe I cared too much, but not about the renovation. We'd been talking about fixing that kitchen for almost 2 years, broken drawers, faded counters, outdated tiles. I used to think he avoided it because of the money, or the time, or his work hours. But eventually, I understood, he simply didn't see it anymore. He walked through our home like it was a hallway to sleep in silence. And I had long stopped decorating it with hope. The day his brother arrived, I was still in my bathrobe. It wasn't planned that way, I had simply forgotten the time. When I opened the door, he stood there with a duffel bag, a coffee in one hand, and a crooked smile that didn't ask permission. "Still as gorgeous as ever," he said without flinching. I rolled my eyes, half laughing, half annoyed. But I noticed the way his gaze traveled, not in a way that lingered, but in a way that remembered. He was the younger one. Always had that looseness about him, like he didn't need to try. Years ago, at family dinners, he'd tease and flirt with everyone, including me. But back then, it was harmless. Now I wasn't so sure. Something had shifted. Or maybe it was me who had shifted, tired of always being the one unnoticed, untouched, unimportant. The first day passed in dust and scraping paint. He worked fast, with sleeves rolled and music playing from his phone. I tried to stay out of the way, but he kept pulling me in, asking my opinion, making me laugh, showing me color samples I'd long given up picking out. He made the house feel alive again, as though time remembered how to stretch into something worth noticing. That night, my husband came home late. I reheated his dinner. He ate without comment, thanked me, and went to his study. I watched his back disappear down the hallway and felt a strange warmth in the pit of my stomach, not for him, but for the memory of the laughter still echoing from the afternoon. The next morning, I found myself changing outfits twice. Not because I wanted to impress, I told myself, but because the first shirt had paint stains and the second felt too tight. Eventually, I settled on something in between. Comfortable. Safe. But when I came down, he was already in the kitchen, shirtless under his overalls, whistling. I asked if he wanted coffee. He said yes. His fingers brushed mine when I handed it to him. Small, meaningless contact. Or maybe not. He smiled differently. I smiled back, like it meant nothing. My husband texted at noon. Busy day. Late again tonight. That was all. No question about how I was. No update about when we'd have dinner together next. I stared at the message and deleted it without replying. Then I heard the hammering stop and his brother's voice calling from the hallway, asking if I could help hold a piece of wood in place. I didn't think. I just said yes. We spent the next hour shoulder to shoulder, fixing cabinets, adjusting measurements, laughing over his clumsy pencil lines. He stood too close. I didn't step back. And when our hands met again, something lingered, not long enough to speak of, but long enough to stay with me all evening. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because of guilt. Because I kept replaying the way he looked at me while waiting for the drill to stop buzzing. Like he saw someone I forgot I used to be. The next few days followed a rhythm: early mornings, dusty afternoons, tired evenings. My husband's schedule didn't change. He barely noticed the changes happening in his own kitchen, much less in the quiet air that thickened between me and his brother. Sometimes I caught myself checking the mirror more than once before coming downstairs. Once, I even put on lipstick before realizing what I was doing. I wiped it off quickly, embarrassed at my own reflection. But that moment stuck with me, not because I regretted it, but because it reminded me I still wanted to be seen. He never said anything too bold. Just enough to linger. Enough to keep me leaning slightly closer when we talked. Enough to make my breath catch when his hand rested too long on the counter next to mine. I convinced myself it was nothing. Harmless. A flicker of what once was. A little attention in a house that had grown cold. But then I found one of his shirts in the laundry room. I picked it up. It smelled of sawdust, sweat, and something warmer. I held it longer than I should have. That night, I stood at the kitchen doorway and watched him clean up. The counters were new. The tiles too. Everything looked brighter, newer, different. Just like the way he looked at me when he turned around and caught my gaze. I turned away before he could say anything. But the heat in my chest stayed all night. The sound of the tile cutter buzzed from the kitchen, breaking through the morning stillness that had settled over the house. I stood at the top of the stairs, holding onto the railing, listening. That sound, so sharp and mechanical, oddly soothed me. It reminded me something was being rebuilt, or at least, that was the illusion we were all supposed to believe. A kitchen, fresh and new. A home, improved. A life, maintained. And yet, I knew something inside me was already crumbling, quietly, brick by emotional brick. I dressed quickly, avoiding anything that might feel too deliberate. Just a casual top, jeans, my hair left loose. It didn't matter what I wore. I told myself that over and over. But as I applied a thin layer of lipstick, I realized my hand wasn't as steady as usual. I told myself it was just routine. Habit. Nothing else. When I stepped into the kitchen, he was crouched near the corner cabinet, adjusting hinges. His shirt clung slightly to his back from the morning heat. I watched him for a moment too long before making my presence known by opening a drawer. He turned, smiled as if it was any other day, and gestured toward the sink, asking me to test the alignment. We moved through the morning in sync, passing tools, holding fixtures, discussing grout colors like two professionals detached from emotion. But each accidental touch lingered. Each pause between tasks filled with something unsaid. There was a moment when I bent to hold a drawer in place and felt his breath, warm and too close behind me. I didn't move. Neither did he. It lasted only a second, but in that second, the air thickened with awareness. Later, he suggested we break for lunch. I made sandwiches. We sat on the back porch, the quiet buzzing of a distant lawnmower our only soundtrack. He talked about a project he did last year, some house upstate. I nodded, half listening, half focused on the way he peeled the crust off his bread like a habit he never grew out of. Then, without looking at me, he said, "You seem lighter this week. Like something woke up in you." It wasn't flirtatious. It was observational. Careful. But the weight of his words landed heavily. I felt exposed. Seen. Not in the romantic way, in the terrifying way. I looked away, swallowed too quickly, and said nothing. Inside, I cleared the plates, rinsed them slowly, letting the water run longer than necessary. I needed something to ground me. To distract me from the ache that had begun to form in my chest. I couldn't name it. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't desire. It was something in between, the sensation of almost stepping off a ledge just to see if someone would catch you. As the afternoon sun shifted, we returned to our tasks. He worked on installing shelves, and I organized new containers we'd purchased. Our arms brushed once when we reached for the same handle. We both laughed, but there was a tightness behind my smile. Then came the moment. So ordinary and unremarkable in appearance, but devastating in its effect. He asked me to hold the cabinet door while he adjusted the hinge. I knelt beside him. Our faces were inches apart. He looked at me, not like a man who wanted to flirt, not like someone chasing excitement. He looked at me like someone who remembered. Who still remembered who I used to be. Before the years dulled me. Before silence settled between rooms. Before I gave up trying to be noticed. And we kissed. Just like that. No warning. No build-up. No words. We kissed. And then, we pulled away. Both of us breathing harder than necessary, staring at each other as if waiting for one of us to turn this moment into a joke, to undo what had just happened with a sarcastic remark or an awkward laugh. But nothing came. We simply returned to the work, hands slightly shaking, eyes avoiding. The room didn't feel like the kitchen anymore. It felt like something else, an intersection between two lives that weren't meant to meet like this. When my husband came home that evening, he walked into the kitchen with a grocery bag and placed it on the counter like he always did. He greeted me, tired but gentle, asked if we could eat earlier tonight. I nodded, pretending not to notice how my voice faltered when I answered. The three of us sat at the table. The room was full of conversation, his stories from work, updates on deliveries, weekend errands, but none of it reached me. I was somewhere else. Sitting beside two men. One I had shared a life with. One I had just crossed an unspoken line with. I noticed how his brother couldn't quite meet my eyes. I noticed how my husband still didn't notice. The irony of it all. The heartbreak in the ordinary. After dinner, I excused myself under the pretense of checking laundry. I sat on the steps in the hallway, pressing my fingers against my temples, trying to push the memory out of my mind. But it didn't go. It stayed. Not like guilt. Like presence. Later that night, I stood at the bathroom mirror, brushing my hair slowly. I watched my reflection, looking for traces of change. Something in the eyes, the mouth, the tilt of the head. But I looked the same. Only I knew different now. And that made all the difference. I lay awake in bed, beside the man who still believed the day had passed like any other. The ceiling was silent. The fan hummed. But inside me, nothing was still. Nothing was quiet. Something had begun. And I didn't know how to stop it. The morning after felt deceptively ordinary. I made coffee before the sun fully rose, standing at the kitchen counter as the aroma filled the room like a veil of normalcy. The house was quiet, too quiet, perhaps, as if the walls themselves were trying not to remember what had happened the day before. My hands moved by memory, opening the cabinet, reaching for the mugs, stirring in sugar. Everything mechanical. Everything pretending. I watched the coffee swirl in my cup, thinking of nothing and everything at once. Thinking about how moments can splinter, like fine cracks in porcelain, invisible until the right kind of pressure reveals just how fragile everything truly is. I didn't hear him come in. He entered from the back porch, barefoot, hair damp as if he'd just splashed water on his face. Our eyes met, just for a second, and in that second everything rushed back, the kiss, the stillness after, the weight of silence. I looked away first. He didn't speak. We moved around each other as if the choreography had been written long ago. He picked up a wrench. I picked up the dish rag. We were in the same room, breathing the same air, but suspended in two different timelines. One where nothing had happened, and one where everything had. My husband had already left for the day, another early meeting, another promise to return late. He kissed my forehead before leaving, his breath warm against my skin, but distant. Not because of what he knew, he didn't know. But because of what he no longer felt. Or perhaps because of what I had stopped reaching for. I cleaned the counters while he installed the final drawer handles. Every scrape of metal on wood echoed too loudly in the room. I tried to focus on the work, but my hands trembled each time I passed too close. He noticed. I knew he did. Yet neither of us acknowledged the undercurrent swirling just beneath the surface. At one point, he asked if I could help hold a frame steady while he secured it. I nodded. We stood close, shoulder to shoulder. I could feel the heat of his skin through my sleeve. My pulse pounded louder than the drill in his hand. When the screw slipped and clattered to the floor, I instinctively bent down to retrieve it, our hands meeting once again. A pause. A flicker. A choice not to speak. When I straightened up, I forced a smile and returned the screw to his hand without meeting his eyes. He said thank you, but the words were barely audible, lost in the space between us. By midday, I couldn't stand the tension anymore. I told him I needed to run errands. Groceries. Cleaners. Anything that would get me out of the house and into air that didn't carry yesterday's memory. He nodded, didn't press. I grabbed my purse and left, the front door closing behind me with a click that sounded far more final than it should have. Driving felt surreal. The roads I'd driven for years now felt unfamiliar. Each stoplight felt like a moment of judgment. I couldn't look at myself in the rearview mirror. I couldn't even turn on the radio. The silence in the car was louder than any music I could have played. At the store, I wandered the aisles without purpose. My list sat forgotten in the side pocket of my purse. I picked up items out of habit: apples, soap, paper towels. My thoughts drifted constantly, pulling me back to the kitchen, to the porch, to that single, stolen moment. I remembered the way his eyes had softened just before it happened, the way his lips didn't press but asked. And how I had answered, not with words, but with something far deeper. Something I hadn't felt in years. Not lust. Not love. Just presence. Being seen. Being wanted. Being more than just the quiet woman who kept the home running while her husband worked late. I returned home just past 2. The car tires crunched softly on the driveway gravel. When I stepped inside, the house smelled faintly of sawdust and lemon polish. He wasn't in the kitchen. His tools were gone. A note sat folded on the counter. Just one line: took a walk. Needed air. I stared at the paper for several minutes before crumpling it and throwing it in the trash. Not out of anger. Out of confusion. Out of fear that I wouldn't be able to hold the line much longer. Later that evening, my husband called. I heard his voice through the speaker, warm, tired, ordinary. He asked about dinner. I told him I'd cook something light. He asked how the cabinets were coming along. I told him we were almost done. He said he might be home earlier than expected. I forced a smile as if he could hear it. That would be nice, I said. When he returned, he brought flowers. Yellow tulips, my favorite, though I hadn't mentioned them in years. I accepted them with a nod and placed them in a vase on the counter. We ate dinner like couples do, talking about nothing, filling space with routine, dancing around the invisible fracture lines forming beneath the table. His brother remained quiet throughout the meal. Not distant, just still. As if any word spoken too loudly might cause the whole house to tilt. After dishes were done, I excused myself to the laundry room. I stood there in the dim light, watching the machine spin. Inside it, one of his shirts. The same one he'd worn the day before. I took it out, still damp, and held it in my hands. The fabric was soft. Faded. Familiar. And then I did something I didn't expect. I folded it carefully. And placed it on the dryer. As if doing so could undo what had happened. As if neatness could replace honesty. As if order could mask the unraveling. That night, in bed, my husband reached for my hand under the covers. I let him. His fingers wrapped around mine, warm, steady, familiar. I closed my eyes, breathing in the silence. Not peace. Not comfort. Just silence. And in that silence, I wondered what would happen next. What path had been set in motion. And whether I was strong enough, or foolish enough, to keep walking it. I woke up with sunlight slipping through the curtains in thin, quiet streaks. The kind of morning that almost tricks you into thinking it's like any other. My husband was already gone. I didn't hear him leave. I rarely did anymore. He moved through the mornings like a ghost, soft footsteps, no words, a mug filled with coffee and a phone already pressed to his ear. It wasn't deliberate. He simply faded into his habits, and I let him. I stayed in bed longer than usual, not because I was tired, but because I didn't want to face the day. There was a heaviness resting on my chest, like the weight of words unsaid, choices unmade, and moments that refused to fade. I stared at the ceiling, tracing faint patterns in the plaster, wondering how I had arrived here, in this house, in this version of my life, where every breath felt borrowed and every silence pressed deeper than comfort. Eventually, I got up. The house was still, save for the soft ticking of the clock in the hallway. I walked barefoot to the kitchen, the tiles cool against my skin. On the counter, a note in my husband's handwriting, "Dinner tonight? Just us. I'll be home by 6. I read it twice. Then a third time. It wasn't romantic or grand, but it was something. A gesture. A signal that he noticed the space growing between us. I folded the note and slipped it into the drawer with the utensils. It didn't feel right to leave it in the open. As I stood there, pouring myself a glass of water, I heard him come in, his brother. He walked in through the garage, wiping dust from his hands with a rag. His shirt clung to his back, damp from effort, and his face was flushed. He looked at me, just briefly, before setting his tools on the table. We exchanged a quiet good morning. That was all. Nothing more. The simplicity of it unnerved me. He said he needed to finish the sealant on the counter edges. I nodded, and he got to work. I watched him move around the kitchen, methodical and precise. I busied myself with cleaning out the fridge, reorganizing jars and tossing expired sauces. The silence between us wasn't tense, not anymore. It was thick, though. Like fog. Everything just a little unclear, a little too close. At one point, I reached above the cabinets to dust the upper shelves. I stood on a small stool, stretching higher than I probably should have. My fingers brushed a stack of old placemats, and the edge of a vase teetered. I felt it begin to fall before I even saw it. But he was there, suddenly and instinctively, his hand steadying my back as the vase settled safely back into place. We both froze. His hand still on my back. My breath caught mid-chest. Neither of us moved. And then, as if pulled by gravity, neither of us had the strength to resist, our eyes met. We kissed. It was brief. Unplanned. Not filled with passion, but with something quieter. A confirmation. A crossing of that invisible line we'd danced around for too long. A decision that neither of us had voiced, but both had already made. We stepped back at the same time. His eyes dropped to the floor. Mine went to the sink. The silence returned, but this time it held something different, not anticipation, not guilt, just wait. The rest of the afternoon passed in fragments. He finished his work. I swept the floors. We didn't speak of it. We didn't touch again. But everything felt changed. The house felt smaller. The air, thicker. Even the light through the windows seemed to hesitate. When he said he needed to head out for a bit, to pick up more supplies, I nodded. I didn't ask where he was really going. I didn't want to know. I was alone again, but not in the way I used to be. Not in the peaceful, predictable quiet that once wrapped around my afternoons like a blanket. This was different. This was the silence of aftermath. The silence of recognition. I looked around the kitchen, newly finished and gleaming, and felt an ache in my chest. Beautiful, but changed. Like me. By 5:30, I started preparing dinner. I chose dishes I knew he liked: grilled chicken, rosemary potatoes, sautéed vegetables. I poured a glass of wine, not for myself, but to set the table. I lit a candle, not for romance, but because the evening light was too dim. When he walked in at 6, his tie already loosened, his eyes tired, he paused in the doorway. He looked at the table, the food, the candlelight, and then at me. "You didn't have to," he said softly. "I wanted to," I lied. We sat. We ate. We talked about simple things, his meetings, my plans for the garden, a letter from my sister. He made a few jokes. I laughed at the right times. We looked like a couple trying. Maybe we were. Maybe we were just pretending. After dinner, I cleared the plates. He offered to help, but I said I had it. He stood behind me for a moment, like he was going to say something, but didn't. Then he walked to the living room and turned on the television. I washed the dishes slowly, my hands submerged in warm water, the scent of lemon soap filling the air. I could hear the muffled voices of a news anchor from the other room. I could hear my own heartbeat, steady but not calm. When everything was clean, I dried my hands and stood there for a long moment, staring out the window. The garden was dark. The porch light flickered once and held steady. I felt a chill run up my arms and wrapped them around myself. That night, as we got ready for bed, everything was quiet again. He brushed his teeth. I folded towels. We changed into pajamas, moving around each other like two dancers following separate rhythms on the same stage. In bed, he reached for my hand again. I let him. And this time, I closed my eyes not to sleep, but to block out everything I didn't want to face. Because what had started as a quiet slip was now a presence I couldn't ignore. And even though nothing had been said aloud, I knew we had entered a place there was no easy way back from. The next morning began with the sharp, bright light of late summer spilling through the blinds, painting thin, golden lines across the hardwood floor. I blinked against it, momentarily unsure of what day it was. The weight in my chest quickly reminded me. I sat up slowly, careful not to wake him, though he was already up and gone. His side of the bed was cold. Only a faint indentation in the pillow remained. I stayed there longer than I should have, hands resting on the blanket bunched in my lap, thoughts spiraling in slow, disjointed circles. Everything in the house was too still. I could hear the quiet humming of the refrigerator downstairs and the soft creak of wood settling. But it wasn't the kind of quiet that brings peace. It was the kind that echoes everything you don't want to say. Eventually, I got dressed and went downstairs. The kitchen looked exactly as we left it, spotless, newly finished, neutral. The kind of kitchen that might appear in a magazine spread, untouched by the messiness of real life. Only I knew better. Only I could feel the residue of moments etched into its corners. I turned on the kettle and leaned against the counter, the marble cool under my palm. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. 9:23. I heard the garage door open. Seconds later, he walked in, the brother, hair damp, shirt slightly wrinkled, holding a small bag of groceries. His eyes met mine for only the briefest second before he set the bag on the counter and said he picked up milk and fruit. His voice was even, measured. No tremble. No wait. I responded with a nod and a quiet thank you, as if we were strangers performing a well-practiced ritual of politeness. He moved to put the items away, and I watched him, barely breathing. Every movement of his hand felt exaggerated to me, the way he opened the fridge, the way his back curved as he reached for the bottom shelf, the way his fingers brushed a cabinet door closed. None of it meant anything. And yet, it meant everything. After breakfast, we moved into separate corners of the house. He returned to the garage, or maybe to the backyard, I didn't ask. I vacuumed the living room, rearranged throw pillows, refolded blankets that weren't wrinkled. Anything to stay busy. Anything to stop thinking about what had already happened and what might still come. Around midday, the neighbor came by, the one with the hedge that always needed trimming. He knocked to ask if we'd noticed a water leak near the edge of the shared fence. I stepped outside, followed him around the side yard, feigning concern. As he pointed to a spot in the grass where the soil was unusually soft, I nodded and asked questions, grateful for the small distraction. Then he said something that turned my breath to ice. My outdoor camera's been acting strange. Recorded way too much motion last night, thought it might have been a raccoon or something. But it looked like people were walking around near your porch. Probably nothing. He said it with a laugh. A casual observation. A neighborly update. But my chest clenched. I kept my expression neutral, thanked him, said we'd check. My voice didn't shake, but my knees nearly did. As soon as he left, I went back inside and locked the door. I didn't know why. There was no danger. Not really. But I felt exposed, like someone had peeled back the surface of my life and left it raw. I sat on the couch, my hands trembling in my lap. Maybe he didn't see anything. Maybe it really was just a raccoon. Maybe the camera was faulty. Or maybe it saw exactly what it wasn't supposed to. I didn't tell anyone. Not him. Not his brother. I buried it. By late afternoon, my husband texted that he'd be home early. I reread the message twice, then stood to begin preparing dinner again. Not because I wanted to, but because I needed the routine. The structure. The normalcy of peeling vegetables and seasoning chicken. I needed the predictability of chopping onions, of placing plates on the table at specific angles, of lighting the same candle I had lit the night before. The scent of garlic and rosemary filled the air. I moved through the kitchen like a shadow of myself, performing tasks I once took pride in, now only clinging to them for stability. He returned just before 6. This time, he brought dessert, a box from the bakery I used to love, back when we still made time for weekend brunches and afternoon coffee on the porch. He smiled as he handed it to me. Thought we could use something sweet. I thanked him and placed it on the counter. Dinner was quiet, but not strained. He asked about my day. I answered. I asked about his. He answered. Our conversation moved like two boats passing, never colliding, never quite drifting too far apart. His brother didn't join us. He said he had errands to run. That was the only explanation he offered. Neither of us questioned it. After dinner, my husband suggested a walk. It had been months since we walked together, really walked, side by side, no destination, no errands. Just steps for the sake of steps. I said yes. We walked in silence for a while. The neighborhood was calm, the evening cool. Trees rustled gently overhead, and porch lights blinked on one by one. He talked about the renovation, about how well his brother had helped, about how much better the house looked. I nodded, agreed. Then, as we turned the corner, he stopped. You've been distant, he said. Not cold. Just somewhere else. I didn't deny it. I didn't know how to. I looked at him, really looked, and saw the lines around his eyes, the way his mouth tensed when he didn't know what else to say. I wanted to speak. I wanted to give him something. But the words stayed lodged in my throat. I've been tired, I finally whispered. He nodded. I know the feeling. We returned home not as a couple who'd just had a breakthrough, but as two people who understood that something had shifted. Whether we acknowledged it or not didn't matter. The shift had already happened. That night, as I lay in bed again, the shadows on the ceiling looked sharper. I thought about the camera. I thought about the porch. I thought about what might already be recorded. And what it would mean if it ever came to light. The morning air was unusually still. Even the birds seemed quieter than usual, as if nature itself understood that something had shifted beneath the surface of this ordinary suburban life. I lay in bed longer than I should have, my eyes tracing the faint lines of light that filtered through the blinds. My husband had left early again, and the silence he left behind clung to the room like moisture. When I finally rose, I moved through the house with the deliberate slowness of someone walking through a museum of their own life. Every object felt like a relic, every chair a memory. The kitchen, pristine and fully renovated now, seemed almost foreign. It no longer felt like it belonged to us, or at least, not to the version of us that used to exist. The note on the fridge caught my eye. A reminder from my husband, dinner with clients tonight. Don't wait up. I read it twice, then folded it and dropped it in the drawer next to the takeout menus. It was easier than thinking too hard about the patterns we had both come to accept. He entered the kitchen an hour later, his hair still damp from a shower, sleeves rolled, a faint scrape on his forearm like he had bumped into something during work. He didn't speak at first. Neither did I. There was nothing we could say that wouldn't call attention to the invisible line we had already crossed. He asked if I needed help with anything around the house. I told him the light in the laundry room was flickering. He nodded, said he'd take a look. As he walked away, I noticed the way his shoulders moved beneath the fabric of his shirt, the way his hand brushed the wall as he passed. Every motion etched into my memory, whether I wanted it there or not. Later, I stood in the backyard watering the plants along the fence. The sun had climbed higher, burning off the lingering clouds from the morning. The warmth on my skin should have felt comforting, but it only reminded me of everything simmering just beneath the surface. I bent to adjust a pot, and when I stood up, I saw him standing at the edge of the lawn, a bottle of cold water in his hand, watching me. I didn't wave. I didn't smile. I just looked back at him, and that was enough. He crossed the yard slowly, handed me the bottle, and said nothing. The air between us was heavy, not with anticipation, but with the weight of knowing. Of understanding where this was going and how far we had already let it go. We both sat on the patio steps, saying nothing. The hum of insects and distant lawnmowers filled the silence. A breeze lifted the edge of the tablecloth still pinned down from yesterday's lunch. I stared at it, fixated on the way it fluttered without fully flying away. He spoke first. "You know this can't keep happening." I didn't respond. Not because I disagreed, but because I didn't have anything to say that would make it better or different. We both knew the truth. But the truth didn't change what had already happened, or what would happen again. He looked away, his jaw tightening, then loosening as if working through some private restraint. I saw his hand rest against the step beside mine, close but not touching. The nearness felt louder than if he'd spoken my name. I stood up slowly and said I had errands to run. He nodded, not looking at me, and stayed seated as I walked back through the house. I didn't go far. Just to the local market and back. I picked up a few things we didn't need. Lemons. A jar of olives. Some fresh herbs. I wandered longer than necessary through the aisles, pretending I was making decisions when, in truth, I was simply avoiding going home. When I returned, the house was empty. He had gone out, left no note, no message. I felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. I put the groceries away and moved upstairs to sort the linen closet. Anything to fill the time. Anything to avoid sitting still long enough to feel everything waiting just beneath the surface. Hours passed. The sun dipped low, turning the sky gold. I began preparing a light dinner, out of habit more than anything. I wasn't hungry. I just needed something to do with my hands. He came back just as I was setting the kettle on the stove. The door creaked softly as it closed behind him. I didn't turn around right away. I could feel him behind me, the same way you can sense a shift in the air before a storm. He cleared his throat. "I'm leaving tomorrow." I finally turned. His face was unreadable, his eyes avoiding mine. He said his friend upstate needed help with a cabin. That he'd planned to go anyway. That it was probably better for everyone. I nodded, slowly. "How long?" "A few weeks. Maybe more." We stood there in silence. Two people suspended in a moment that had already passed but still refused to let go. Then, as if drawn by something neither of us had the strength to resist, we moved closer. No words. No justifications. We spent the night together. I won't describe it. I can't. Not because it's unspeakable, but because it belongs to a space that can't be translated into language. It happened in the pauses between sentences, in the spaces between regrets and desires. In the knowledge that this would be the last time. That it had to be. And in the early hours of the morning, as the world outside began to stir again, I lay awake beside him, listening to the rhythm of his breath, knowing everything was about to change. Not because of what we had done. But because of what I was no longer willing to deny. When I woke, the light had already changed. It was softer now, the edges of the morning blurred by the weight of what had passed. The sheets beside me were cold, the imprint on the pillow already fading. I sat up slowly, not with regret but with a quiet, resigned awareness. The kind of awareness that settles deep in the body and makes you feel older than the day before. I wrapped myself in my robe and walked down the hall, each step somehow heavier than usual. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't just exist, it presses. The kind that feels like it's asking questions you don't want to answer. The kitchen was spotless. No breakfast laid out. No sounds of drawers opening or chairs shifting. Just stillness. I walked to the window and pulled back the curtain slightly, just enough to see the driveway. His car was gone. No note. No goodbye. Just absence. I don't know what I expected. A message, maybe. Some small acknowledgement of what had been shared. But as I stood there, staring at the empty gravel, I realized that what happened between us had never been designed to last beyond that moment. It was a fragment. A closing chapter. Something complete in its incompleteness. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, my coffee growing cold between sips. My mind wandered in slow, reluctant circles, not trying to make sense of things, just trying to accept them. The silence in the room was no longer comforting. It was reflective. It showed me who I had become, and who I hadn't been in years. Later that morning, I walked upstairs to change the bedsheets in the guest room. His room. I moved slowly, folding the blanket, fluffing the pillow, opening the window to let the stale air out. The scent lingered, faint but undeniable. Something earthy and clean and not mine. I paused with the pillow in my hands, pressing my face to the cotton for a second too long before setting it aside. By the time I returned downstairs, my husband was home. His car was in the driveway, door left ajar as if he had just run inside for something quick. I wasn't expecting him back so soon. I checked the clock. 11:15. Unusual for a weekday. I found him in the hallway, standing in front of the cabinet where we keep the extra light bulbs and batteries. His brow was furrowed in a way I hadn't seen in years, not confused, not angry. Just distracted. He turned to look at me. "Have you seen a small flash drive? I thought I left it near the garage door, but it's not there." The air around me thickened. I swallowed. "No, I haven't." He nodded slowly. "It might have gotten tossed out. It's probably nothing." I nodded back, keeping my face still, my voice even. He returned to the garage without another word, and I stood there, motionless, heart pounding in the softest way, not fast, not loud, just heavy. The flash drive. It had to be the one the neighbor mentioned. The one that might have recorded something it shouldn't. I thought about the way he'd mentioned it so casually. I thought about whether he had seen anything. Whether he knew and was waiting for me to confess. The rest of the day passed in a strange rhythm. I busied myself with chores I didn't care about, reorganizing pantry shelves, folding towels that were already folded, watering plants that didn't need water. My husband stayed in his office most of the afternoon. The door was closed. I didn't knock. Around 5, I stood on the back patio with a cup of tea, watching the sun begin to dip behind the trees. The breeze was gentle, brushing across my skin like a whisper. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting it wash over me, hoping to feel something other than this growing weight inside me. That's when I saw the neighbor again. He was across the fence, setting down a bag of mulch. He noticed me and lifted a hand in greeting. I nodded back, trying to act natural, to not let the tension show in my shoulders. He walked over to the fence slowly. "Hey, just wanted to say I figured out the camera issue. Turns out it wasn't a raccoon after all. Must have been the wind triggering the motion sensor. Still, caught a lot of odd footage the last few nights. Didn't mean anything by it, just thought you might want to know." I forced a smile. "Thanks for the update." He tilted his head. "You know, if you ever want me to delete any of it, I can. Just say the word." My mouth felt dry. "I'm sure it's fine." He nodded and turned away, walking back toward his shed. I watched him go, then slowly stepped back into the house, shutting the door behind me as if it would keep the world from closing in. Inside, the silence felt even heavier. My husband was still upstairs. The house seemed to be holding its breath. I stood at the sink, staring out the window. The dishes from lunch were still in the drying rack. The smell of rosemary from last night's dinner still lingered faintly in the corners of the room. I reached into the cabinet and pulled out the flash drive. It had been there all along, buried under a stack of rarely used placemats. I turned it over in my hand, feeling the sharp edges press into my skin. I didn't plug it in. I didn't need to see. I already knew what was on it. I placed it back in the drawer and closed it gently. That night, as we sat at opposite ends of the couch watching television, everything felt fragile. My husband's face glowed faintly from the screen's light. He laughed at something the host said, then looked at me, as if searching for something in my expression. I smiled. Not because I meant it, but because I still didn't know what else to do. The next morning came without fanfare. No thunderclap of realization, no breaking point. Just the gentle unfolding of another day, another sequence of motions so familiar they nearly masked the quiet unraveling beneath them. I rose early and moved through the house as if nothing had shifted, though everything had. The kettle whistled. The curtains danced faintly in the breeze through the cracked kitchen window. I moved a spoon through my tea in slow circles, watching the steam rise and twist. The flash drive stayed in the drawer. I didn't touch it again. Not because I was afraid, or maybe I was, but because its existence had become like a stone lodged in my chest. I couldn't confront it, and yet I couldn't forget it. Knowing it was there, unplayed, was both a safety and a threat. I carried it with me in silence, like a secret folded into the lining of my thoughts. My husband stayed home that day. A surprise. He said something about taking a mental reset, the way people do when they need a break but don't want to admit it's from each other. I nodded, said I understood, even though I didn't. Not really. Or maybe I did too well. He spent the morning on the phone in his office. I kept to the kitchen, pretending to clean, though everything was already spotless. I wiped down surfaces that didn't need wiping, organized spices alphabetically, rearranged cookbooks that hadn't been touched in months. Every movement was a distraction, a deflection. I kept my hands busy so my mind wouldn't wander where it shouldn't. But it did anyway. It wandered to the night I couldn't take back. To the skin I still remembered. To the absence that had followed and the silence that had filled it. To the breathless, terrifying stillness of a moment that meant something I hadn't yet dared to define. Around midday, I stepped outside to water the potted plants on the back porch. The sun was high and sharp, and the wooden boards beneath my feet radiated heat. I stood in the brightness, hose in hand, watching the soil darken beneath the spray. The water pooled briefly, then sank into the earth, disappearing as if nothing had happened. When I turned to go back inside, I saw him, the neighbor, in his yard again, crouched near the fence with a rake. He looked up and nodded. I lifted a hand in return. Neither of us crossed the invisible line that separated our lives, but I felt the weight of his awareness. Whether he'd seen something or not didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that something had shifted between us, the possibility of knowledge, the quiet threat of exposure. I stayed inside the rest of the afternoon. My husband emerged from his office briefly to ask if I wanted to take a walk later. I told him I wasn't feeling well. He didn't press. Instead, he went alone. I watched him from the living room window, his figure shrinking down the sidewalk, shoulders rounded, hands buried deep in his pockets. He didn't look back. I stayed at the window long after he disappeared from view. When he returned an hour later, he brought flowers. Wildflowers wrapped in brown paper, the kind sold by the side of the road. He said he saw them and thought of me. I took them gently, pressing the stems to my chest like something fragile. "Thank you," I said, quietly. He smiled, a little. I thought maybe we could have dinner outside tonight. It wasn't a question. It was hope, wrapped in the softness of suggestion. I nodded. We ate beneath the patio lights strung across the back fence, their glow faint in the dusk. The food was simple. Grilled vegetables, cold pasta, sparkling water. He talked about an old vacation we'd taken years ago, to a beach town where everything smelled of salt and sunscreen. I laughed at the story he told, a memory about losing his shoes in the sand, and it felt both real and rehearsed. I let myself laugh, but something inside remained silent. The flash drive still hadn't been mentioned. Maybe he really hadn't found it. Or maybe he had, and this dinner, these flowers, this softness, was his way of navigating the space between knowledge and accusation. A way of saying, I know, without saying it aloud. Later, as we washed dishes together, I dropped a fork into the sink too hard. It clanged against the steel, sharp and jarring. He flinched slightly, then reached to steady the plate in my hands. You okay? He asked. I nodded. Just tired. He studied my face for a moment longer than necessary. I turned away and continued rinsing, grateful for the cover of running water. That night in bed, he lay close to me, his breath even, his warmth familiar. I stayed still, eyes open in the dark, listening to the quiet. The ceiling fan spun overhead, casting faint shadows on the walls. Eventually, he whispered, I miss how things used to feel. I didn't answer. I didn't move. He turned onto his side and faced away. And I lay there, unmoving, a single thought echoing in my mind, so do I. But I also knew that the past could not be resurrected. Not when parts of it had already begun to rot. Not when the soil beneath us had shifted too far. I rose early again the next morning, before the sun had fully broken over the horizon. I stood in the kitchen holding the flash drive in my hand, the plastic smooth and cool. I considered throwing it away. Considered smashing it. Considered plugging it in. Instead, I opened the drawer, placed it back inside, and shut it firmly. There would be time for truths. But not yet. I spent most of the morning cleaning the house, though it didn't need cleaning. The floors had been swept just 2 days ago, the countertops wiped down, the windows polished until they barely reflected anything back. But I needed to move. I needed motion, even if it was pointless. Stillness had become dangerous, an invitation for thought, for regret, for reckoning. I started with the living room, dusting the shelves slowly, one photo frame at a time. There were pictures of us from years ago, at the lake, at a cousin's wedding, on a road trip we'd taken in our first year of marriage. We looked younger, of course, but not just in the way faces age. There was something lighter in our expressions back then. Less practiced. Less tired. I took each frame down, wiped it gently, and returned it to its place. In the dining room, I straightened the table runner, adjusted the position of the chairs. I passed by the mirror near the front door and stopped. I studied my reflection for longer than I meant to. Not out of vanity, but curiosity. I looked for signs. Traces, evidence. But all I saw was a face that had carried too much too quietly for too long. When I stepped outside to shake out a rug, the neighbor was mowing his lawn. He waved casually, and I waved back. His expression was unreadable, as it always was. We hadn't spoken since the brief exchange about the flash drive. And still, I couldn't tell what he knew, or if he knew anything at all. That not knowing had become its own weight. I returned inside, closed the door behind me, and stood in the hallway for a moment, eyes shut, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant whir of the mower. Then I walked to the drawer. The flash drive was still there, untouched, sitting quietly beneath the stack of cloth napkins I had folded so carefully weeks ago. I took it out and held it for a moment. My fingers trembled slightly, though the rest of me remained still. I didn't plug it in. Instead, I walked to the back door and stepped out into the garden. The air was warm, the soil damp from last night's rain. I moved past the hydrangeas and into the far corner, where the compost bin sat tucked behind a row of bushes. I opened the lid and dropped the flash drive in. It made no sound as it landed. Just like that, it was gone. I closed the lid, wiped my hands on my pants, and walked back inside. No ceremony. No sigh of relief. Just a quiet end to something that never should have started. Later that afternoon, my husband returned home early again. He said he'd canceled a meeting, something about needing a slower pace. He looked tired, though he tried to hide it behind polite conversation and soft smiles. We sat on the porch for a while, watching the shadows stretch across the lawn. I was thinking, he said suddenly, maybe we could go away for a weekend. Just us. No work. No obligations. I looked at him. His eyes were hopeful, but cautious. Like someone offering a hand they weren't sure would be taken. Where would we go? I asked. He shrugged. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere we don't know anyone. I nodded. Maybe. We sat in silence for a while longer. The cicadas buzzed in the distance. A squirrel darted across the fence. I know things have been, he trailed off, searching for the right word. Different. Yes, I said, simply. He turned to face me. I don't want to lose what we still have. His voice was steady, but I could hear the uncertainty beneath it. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence fill the space between us. Finally, I said, neither do I. And I meant it. But meaning something doesn't erase what's already been done. It doesn't untangle the threads or unring the bell. It just gives you a place to start. If you choose to. That evening, we made dinner together. It wasn't planned. He had started chopping vegetables while I stood at the sink, and before I knew it, we were moving in rhythm again, passing utensils, seasoning to taste, washing dishes as we cooked. There was something comforting in the routine, something grounding in the familiarity of it all. After dinner, he opened a bottle of wine and poured us each a glass. We sat at the table, the windows open, the night air drifting in. We talked about nothing in particular. Old movies. His favorite childhood snack. The way the new grout in the kitchen still smelled faintly like clay. It was ordinary. And for the first time in a long time, I let myself be part of it. When we went to bed, he reached for my hand under the covers again. I let him. His fingers laced gently with mine, and neither of us said a word. I lay awake long after he'd fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling, listening to his breath. It was steady, slow. I counted each exhale like a metronome, anchoring me to the present. I didn't know what the future would look like. I didn't know what might be rebuilt, or what would stay fractured just beneath the surface. But I knew this, I had made a choice. Not just to stay, but to be honest, with myself, at least. The truth had its own gravity, and it would always be there, even if no one ever spoke of it again. In the quiet of that room, beneath the weight of everything we were and everything we weren't, I finally let myself breathe. Not with ease, not yet. But with intention. And sometimes, that's the only way forward.